Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Hersey. Happy Thursday to each of you, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar titled The Intersection of Human Trafficking and Substance Use. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration between the Florida Department of Children and Families and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and are only able to view your name. Your webcam and microphone have been disabled. If you have questions, please send them to all panelists by using the chat panel. The button to open the panel is usually located on the upper right side of your monitor. Please use the chat panel to send any questions you may have as you think of them. The presenter will address questions as time permits. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio at any time during today's presentation, there are a few options to try using the Communicate menu. For computer audio, click Communicate menu, then click the Audio Connection panel. Click Disconnect, then click the Communicate menu and Audio Connection panels again, then click Call in using the computer and follow the instructions. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try using the I will call in option under the Communicate menu. The access code and event password will be posted in the chat panel. Please note you must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen to receive a statement of completion. We are unable to verify attendance if you are not connected to WebEx via a computer or mobile device. Therefore, call-in only attendees will not be eligible for a statement of completion or CEUs. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FATA website within 30 business days. To access the recording and PowerPoint, visit www.fata.org, navigate to the Resource Center, and click on Training Library as shown on the screen. FATA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. A statement of credit and CEUs for up to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar. CEUs are available for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. Completing the post-webinar evaluation is necessary to receive CEUs or to access your statement of credit. Please note that the evaluation will close at the end of the day on Tuesday, October 29th, 2024. At the end of today's webinar, you will have 3 opportunities to complete the evaluation: a link I post in the chat, a follow-up email from WebEx, and an automatic web browser pop-up when I end the webinar. To complete the evaluation, you will first need to register or sign into your account. Please ensure that your name and email address match the name and email you used when you registered for today's webinar. Information you provide FATA as part of registering remains confidential. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license number for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site for the first time. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside the state of Florida, you do not need to provide your certification number when you register with our site. If you need assistance with account registration, login information, or accessing the evaluation, fill out a contact form on our website or email training@floridabha.org before October 29th. Please note that WebEx monitors the arrival and departure times of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide a statement of completion if you do not attend the entire webinar, and we are not permitted to provide partial CE credit. Statements of credit will be posted within 30 business days after the evaluation closes in an individual professional development section of your FATA account. For licensed practitioners, CEUs will be reported to CE Broker within the same time frame. Today's webinar contains mature thematic material that some attendees may find distressing, including but not limited to substance use, abuse, and stories of human trafficking survivors, some of whom are children. Participants are advised to step away if necessary. If you or someone you know is affected by these topics, please consider seeking support from a supervisor or mental health professional. This presentation is intended solely for educational purposes. The views, opinions, information, and content expressed in the presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the state of Florida, the Florida Department of Children and Families, the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, or the Florida Behavioral Health Association. Attendees should note that sessions are recorded and published in various media. Our presenter today is Dr. Nicole Kelly. Dr. Kelly is a clinical psychologist who consults with agencies on trauma-informed care, programming for commercially sexually exploited youth, culturally responsive services, vicarious trauma, and leadership development through Placey Consulting, LLC. Nicole has been training multidisciplinary audiences on trauma-related topics since 2015. She has taught graduate-level psychology courses on human trafficking and substance use and authored a commercial sexual exploitation intervention and prevention curriculum. Now please welcome our presenter, Dr. Nicole Kelly.
Well, thank you. And good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. I see a few good mornings in the chat, so that is delightful. Really excited for us to be here today and to tackle this topic. I love getting to speak about human trafficking. As I was introduced to this topic a little over a decade ago, actually, I was working in residential care with adolescents who were system involved. And at the time I was in LA County. Now I'm in Houston. But at the time when I was working in LA County, the juvenile probation department really started to push providers who were county funded to start to learn a little bit more about trafficking. Now, at this point, we had already adopted a trauma-informed model, but we were finding, as we started to learn about kids who had been sex trafficked, we started to realize, hey, these are some of the kids that we have. And at that time, about a decade ago, a little bit more than that, there were not very many providers doing work around the topic like there are today. And especially back then, there were not very many residential programs that were specialized to work with kids who had been trafficked. And so from starting to reach out to the residential facilities across the US, a handful of them that existed, I didn't get very clear direction in terms of kind of how they were building programming or adjusting it, to really better serve the population. And so that really kind of just led to me getting more involved in some of the work LA County was doing around human trafficking. And I ended up stepping away from doing more direct service to do more consultation and training around the topic. And over the years of getting to do work around trafficking, I have been very fortunate to meet and collaborate and work with and hire, many folks who have lived experience of being trafficked. And one of the big themes, not only has there been a whole lot of trauma that has accompanied so many of their stories, but also seeing this theme of substance use. So really grateful, for us to have this time and space to talk about it. And one of the things that was such a reminder of the importance of this topic was, as various counties and various states were starting to put policy and programming into place and really build multidisciplinary work, one of the things that we found was that substance use providers was one of those key stakeholders who needed to be at the table. But oftentimes what we were finding was there weren't very many who, one, really understood trauma, and throw trafficking in there was even less. So again, this is such a needed topic for us to talk about today. As we talk today, if there are questions, please feel free to share in the chat. I'll address those as we go, so don't feel like you have to wait till the end of our time to ask a question and or share something. To echo what Robert mentioned earlier, as we think about our time today, even though we are a short time, we are going to dive in and we're going to hit on some heavy topics. For those who are doing work, I assume most folks are semi-familiar with trafficking. Some folks might be already working with the population. And for those of you who are already doing work with youth and young adults and adults who have been and or are trafficked, you know it is a lot of trauma. It is a heavy topic. For those of you who might not be as familiar with the topic or the population, we welcome you today. And it is just a reminder for you that doing this work and talking about this population and serving this population, it comes with such an honor to work with these folks. But it can really start to take a toll on our hearts and our minds as we are exposed to some really ugly aspects of society. As we think about just the intentional harm that is done to these individuals, it is not easy to see. It's not easy to bear witness to. And just given how trafficking kind of falls under this larger umbrella of trauma, we're going to be talking about trauma. One of the things we have learned over the years is we've learned just how broad that umbrella is of trauma. There are so many different aspects of trauma, and we have come to learn that so many of us are touched by it. And not just those, in everyday society. We see that many folks in our field have been and sometimes are, going through trauma in the midst of doing this work. And so it is a reminder to please take care of you. And not just as we talk today, definitely as we talk today, if it gets tough, I definitely want to encourage you to step away for a moment. That is part of how we take care of ourselves. But also just as a reminder for us to do this work and to do this work in a way where we are able to enjoy it, to do it where we feel like we're making a difference, to do it where we aren't dreading it. It comes with us being intentional with taking care of ourselves. As we think about working with highly traumatized, highly stigmatized, highly oppressed populations, again, it takes a toll. And as we think about how many hours out of our workday are we exposed to that? And what is that like in proportion to how much time we are intentional with spending to take care of ourselves? Some of us, we don't even go to the restroom when we need to, or we don't drink water or we don't eat lunch. And we skip that stuff to answer an email, have another meeting, etc. And it's hard to really teach our clients and their families to invest in themselves and to take care of themselves if we don't take care of ourselves. So as we start off, I want to invite folks to go into the chat. Also, just to make sure folks are familiar where it's at. So if you do have questions, you know where to type in. So I want to invite folks to go into the chat here and share how this morning, not the weekend, not over the summer, but this morning, what have you done to take care of you? I will start us off and then I'm going to share some of the wonderful things you all share here in the chat. And as we think about this, as you think about what are you doing to take care of you this morning, to really think intentionally about what have I done to kind of create that space to take care of me. So for me, I got to take my dog on a nice walk, which has been delightful because I hurt my knee, so it's been really hard to get out there and do that. So got to take him on the trail this morning, and I have my lovely cup of coffee now. All right, I see some things coming in the chat here, which is wonderful. We got some breakfast. We have, gotta scroll down here. Taking dogs for a walk, some time of prayer and worship, getting to cuddle with the cats, listening to some music. We got lots of breakfast. Ooh, even getting the nails done before work. Taking time to floss the teeth. taking in the vitamins, some time in the Bible, drinking lots of water, somebody ordering their coffee in. I'm getting to spend some time journaling, actually doing some meal prep and making lunch, having some healthy breakfast, getting to go on a walk with the pups as well. We got lots of coffee, lots of time spending with God, getting to do some walking, lots of breakfast, and even getting to sleep in because there was a crisis at work last night. Some music that was uninterrupted, lots of coffee and breakfast, even somebody getting out there to ride the horse this morning. That sounds delightful. I've been telling my husband I want a horse. So thank you for reminding me. I need to bug him about that later on today. Also spending a little extra time getting dressed in the morning, cuddling with the cat, so it is not just the dog. Some audiobooks, getting to love on the dogs a little bit more. Wonderful. As I shared some of those things that we are doing to take care of ourselves, if you maybe are not a morning person or did not get that time in, hopefully just hearing some of the ways folks are able to get it in is a reminder for how crucial it is. And the last thing I will say about this is, again, it is hard to teach others to invest in themselves, to set boundaries so they make time for themselves, to care for themselves, to love themselves, to have compassion on themselves, etc., when they don't see it in us. I saw this from doing a focus group some years ago in LA County. The probation department had asked me to do a focus group with some of our kids who were in the system and who were in care. And one of the questions we were talking about during the focus group was along the lines of, what do you need from us as providers? How can we better support you? And what struck me and has stayed with me was hearing how many of them make comments along the lines of, how is so-and-so supposed to support me or help me when they look exhausted, they look burnt out, they don't look like they invest in themselves? And it was hearing comments along those lines time and time again that really kind of caused me to sit back and think about, man, it is, their experience of us speaks louder than the words coming out of our mouth. And so this is where it becomes so, so important. And especially, when we do experience loss. I see that coming in the chat. It becomes such a reminder for how important it is to care for us. All right, as we get going here, again, we're going to do some large group discussion in the chat, kind of like we have been. But again, if there's questions or anything, please feel free to ask. Don't feel like you have to wait till the end of our time. All right, so as we think about, some of the stigma that exists, as we think about somebody who's a prostitute, as we think about somebody who's a sex worker, want to think about what are some of the ways larger society views this individual. So what are some thoughts? Feel free to go here in the chat. What are some ways society kind of views a prostitute, or a sex worker? Dirty, low morals. Workers are seen as they want to be there. I don't see chains on them. They're disposable. A lack of respect. A whore. It's not an actual profession. A victim. Views them as trashy. Drug users. An object. Drug users. They kind of deserve what happened to them. Liars. They don't care about themselves. They're nasty lowlives. Low class. Something is wrong with them. A drug addict, lost, mentally ill, a low life, immoral, a drug user, helpless, not seen, worthless, desperate, invisible, no home training, victimized, sad, trashy. And we're getting invisible, unwanted. We're getting quite a list. And, as we think about these, and some of the words coming in might even be a little G-rated compared to, how folks really see these individuals. And what we see is when folks who are engaged in the commercial sex industry are stigmatized and viewed in such a negative way, it makes it really hard for larger society to see, one, to see their humanity. We have careless coming in. It makes it hard to see their humanity. It makes it hard to think these are people who don't deserve to be in jail. Because when I see it as this is their choice, this is, they're kind of this criminal who's choosing this, who doesn't really have much value, it makes sense that they are locked up behind bars rather than getting help through social services. And so even as we think about some of this, some of the stigma that exists here in the US around folks engaged in the commercial sex industry, this is where we want to think about how does this trickle down to minors? And what we see is that same stigma exists, for our kids who are involved in the commercial sex industry. And in a similar way, as we think about, how society views somebody who misuses drugs and alcohol, what are some of the ways society views someone who uses drugs and alcohol? Even as we were kind of looking at the previous slide, we had drug addict come in multiple times. Low life, they choose this life. Addiction's not real. We're seeing some overlap here with some of the stigma. Worthless, incompetent. It's their choice. They're a junkie. They're weak. Bad parenting. Lack of coping skills. They could quit. Trauma, weak. They did this to themselves. Irresponsible, uncaring, dishonest. Having mental health conditions, a criminal, impulsive. They don't care about themselves. They don't care about anyone. And with both of these, low self-esteem. As we think about the stigma that exists with somebody who is engaged in the commercial sex industry and somebody who uses and misuses drugs and alcohol, these are two topics where there is so much shame, so much judgment, and so much stigma. And then as we think about, well, what happens when we have somebody who has both? What happens when we're working with somebody who has a history of trafficking, as well as who is now has an addiction and is misusing whatever it might be? And how is that individual viewed within larger society? And that again becomes, that right there can be traumatic for many folks. Just the feeling that shame, that stigma, and that judgment. All right, so we are going to do a little overview here of trafficking. Again, we're kind of coming into today assuming folks have a basic understanding. If you do not, there is no judgment, because we all have learned about this topic for the first time at some point in time. I would encourage you, if you are not familiar with this topic and this is, kind of new to you, I would really encourage you to do further training, as we're just going to do a brief overview here, really just scratching the surfaces of it. And there really is so much more to learn about it, so we could better serve the population, so that we can better screen and identify and get folks connected to needed resources. All right, so when we think about human trafficking, think of it as this overarching umbrella. And under this umbrella of trafficking, we have two main forms of trafficking. We have sex trafficking, and then we have labor trafficking. And what we see is that throughout, and not only throughout the US, throughout the world, really, there is a greater focus on the sex trafficking aspect than the labor trafficking. And we could talk about that all day, but we won't. One of those things I will say, as we think about the difference here, or really kind of our focus on the sex trafficking aspect, it has really come, I think, from a lack of understanding that we have of trauma. Because what I've heard many folks say is, well, the sex trafficking aspect, that's where the trauma is. Folks who are labor trafficked, people don't really experience trauma at work or in their job. And that could not be further from the truth. Because as we have come to learn about labor trafficking, we see there is a whole lot of trauma those teens, those young adults, and those adults experience. And many times there's an intersection here between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So even if I was someone who was like, labor trafficking, it's not really my focus. I work with, domestic minors, or, I work with US citizens. So I'm thinking this is an issue that happens to immigrants. So it's not really the population I need to think about. Again, that couldn't be further from the truth, because we have US citizens who are sex trafficked and labor trafficked. We have immigrants who are sex trafficked and labor trafficked. We have adults, we have minors. We have kids in the system, we have kids who were in the system. We have kids and adults not in the system experiencing both. And even if my focus was only in working with youth and or adults who were sex trafficked, to not understand the labor trafficking piece also kind of makes it really hard for me to do my work with those who had been sex trafficked, because there is such an intersection. So we don't have time today to dive into the labor trafficking aspect, but really want to encourage you that if you are not familiar with labor trafficking, to learn more, to seek out more training, because it becomes such a crucial and overlooked topic. All right, so when we think here about our kind of understanding of trafficking, we are going to anchor ourselves in federal legislation. And we're going to talk about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, otherwise known as the TVPA. So the TVPA, this was authorized initially in 2000, and it's been reauthorized many times since, most recently in 2000. And one of the things that's significant about the TVPA was it was the first time we had federal legislation that really kind of said, when this is happening to somebody, by federal law, they are considered a victim of trafficking. Now, here's where there's a little difference when it comes to those over 18 and those under 18. So when we're talking about somebody under the age of 18, the simple fact that they are being trafficked by federal law makes them a victim. Even if that minor is saying, I'm doing this because I want to do it. I'm out there on the streets because I choose to be. No one's forcing me. Even the kid who might be saying that, as well as some other statements, by federal law, is considered a victim of trafficking. Now, where there becomes a little hitch is what happens when somebody turns 18. And when someone turns 18, now they have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And this is where it becomes extremely hard, especially going back to some of the stigma that we talked about earlier. Because what is that like when we as larger society see this adult as some of those words that were described in the chat? It makes it hard to see this is somebody who's being coerced or manipulated. I see them as somebody who's choosing to be out there, choosing to do this, etc. Now we also, start to see here, in 2000, we had federal legislation that defined this is an issue of trafficking. Now, what we have seen is states have taken a while to pass state legislation. I'll reference California as that's where I started becoming informed about this topic and have done work for many years. In California, which for the past decade has really been viewed as a leader in the nation when it has come to addressing trafficking, and particularly the sex trafficking of minors. It took the state of California 16 years to pass state legislation that decriminalized prostitution for minors. And what I saw was when that passed in 2016 and acted in 2017, it's not like minors stopped getting arrested for trafficking. For years, we would hear one of two things. Minors continue to get arrested, even though legally they should not be arrested for a prostitution related crime. Or we would hear they weren't arrested for it. They were arrested for something else, but they sure were looked at and stigmatized and shamed for their involvement in trafficking. And so even though we have legislation, federal and state, that's huge, don't get me wrong, but it becomes the enacting. And the enacting of the legislation really speaks to the training and support that individuals receive. All right, so we're going to look at our states and look at a little report card here. And so this report card comes from an organization, a great national organization called Shared Hope. And what Shared Hope does every year is they look at every state and they look at a few components. They look at how is the state doing when it comes to prosecution and prosecuting those who are trafficked. Sorry, not those who are trafficked, those who are trafficking. It also looks at how is this state in regards to identifying and subsequently then responding to folks that are identified as victims. It looks at the continuum of care. So what happens from moment of identification to getting this individual connected to services, not only in the short term, but kind of that long term. And that continuum of care becomes crucial because what we see and what I've seen from having friends who are trafficked, from working alongside many colleagues who have been trafficked, from doing focus groups with adults and minors who have been trafficked, and especially from my work with the adults, I have seen it is a long, 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 and I cannot underestimate how long it can be of a healing journey. I know folks who have been out of trafficking years and decades, who either have continued in therapy or getting back into it because something's come up. And it's just a reminder that many times how long of a healing journey it is many times longer than what our system's designed for, especially as we see across the nation. There is a push for shorter and shorter term services. So what does that continuum of care look like? Also, what does justice look like for trafficking? Whether it comes from, trying to prosecute the individual who has trafficked them, to seeking restitution, etc. Also looking here at how our states, what tools do they have access to when it comes to really understanding. I'm not a fan of this phrase, but I'm going to say it because it's kind of what we use is that victim-centered criminal justice response. And how do we understand that this is somebody who has experienced a horrendous amount of trauma? And the last thing it looks at is how is this respective state doing when it comes to prevention? So kind of thinking about what sort of trainings, what sort of workshops are we doing to help prevent minors from getting involved in the commercial sex industry? And that becomes important too. And even for folks who are doing work with adults, one of the big risk factors for adults getting involved in the commercial sex industry was being involved as a minor and continuing on when they turned 18. And the other big piece is training. One of the things I saw from my work in California, and mind you, child welfare was great out there because they understood there is so much we need to learn about this topic, that we had, folks, not only we had the state mandating a 1-day training on sex trafficking of minors. We had the state mandating a 2-day training on understanding trauma and how to apply the stages of change model to the population. And many counties have invested in many other trainings and looking at understanding the trauma, understanding motivational interviewing, and the list could go on and on and on of training topics. So with all that being said, when we look at the respective states and see how are they doing in these specific categories. One thing you will notice here on the map, and a sad thing to notice, is there is not one state that is graded as an A. So in a sense, every single state, even the ones such as Florida, that are doing a little better, still have a lot of room to grow. Now, Florida, as you can see on the map, is one of 2 states that is rated as a B. So for the most part, when it comes to Florida, in all the categories I mentioned, criminal provisions, the continuum of care, access to justice for trafficking survivors, a victim-centered criminal justice response, as well as prevention and training, for the most part, Florida's doing pretty well. Florida's kind of rated as like an A or a B in those respective categories. Now, the area where Florida was extremely low in was identification and response. And in that specific category, Florida was rated as a D. And so that really speaks to some room for growth when it comes to being able to identify. And when we think about identifying, this is us collectively. It is not just social services. It is not just mental health. It is not just probation or law enforcement. It is all of us. It's healthcare providers. It's dental providers. It's advocates. It's case managers. It's clinicians. It's group home staff. And the list could go on and on and on. It takes all of us to be able to identify, because if we don't identify, what are we responding to? So that identification becomes such a key piece. In the chat we have, Florida has a lot of room to grow, as I would say, as every state does. And so we want to not see that Florida is at a B and be like, okay, we're kind of ahead of the game compared to most of the US. We want to see, how do we continue to improve? How do we continue to say, hey, this is an issue? And how do we help folks in key decision-making roles at our organizations, in the county, and at the state level? See, hey, this is an issue we need to do more with. Or, we need to do X, Y, and Z. Seeking funding, applying for grants, etc., so we could start to expand some of the services we are able to offer to the population. All right, so since we're going to be kind of focused here on looking at the sex trafficking aspect, we are going to do just a mini, and by mini, I mean mini, overview of what the sex trafficking aspect looks like. And so to understand the commercial aspect of sex trafficking, we're going to start by first talking about sexual exploitation. And so, with sexual exploitation, this is where we have somebody, and mind you, oftentimes we hear trafficking talked about through a gendered lens, meaning when we think about somebody who is exploited, oftentimes we think about a girl. That has been the predominant narrative in our country. We're talking about a teenage girl getting trafficked. And don't get me wrong, our teenage girls are trafficked, but they are not the only gender. And our kids can find themselves exploited for tangible and intangible needs. So think about, for example, especially if you work with kids in care, what is it like if, let's say, we have a kid who runs away, and kid runs away, as many kids who are out on the streets, especially in the middle of the night, especially if it's freezing cold, etc. How are you supposed to care for yourself? I know when I worked in direct care, And especially when I worked in group homes and when I've consulted with group homes, never did I hear a kid who ran away, who took a suitcase, who had all this money with them, who had sleeping bags, had some PB&Js and all that stuff. They left with the clothes on them. So again, that puts them in significant need. So what happens when this kid's on the street and an adult recognizes the vulnerability, maybe approaches them and says, "Hey, you look tired. You look hungry. Let me take you to McDonald's. Let me get you something to eat." And in exchange for that meal, in exchange for shelter, they engage in sexual activity. Oftentimes within, for anyone who does work with our unsheltered youth, many times this is referred to as survival sex. But really what it is child abuse, first and foremost, and it is an adult abusing a child, and they are taking advantage of that need rather than getting them connected and supported. All right, so also when we think about somebody who is, when we think about kind of this commercial aspect, so there are a few different terms that are used here, all referring to the same population. And sometimes folks refer to this as commercial sexual exploitation. Sometimes folks refer to it as sex trafficking. Sometimes folks refer to it as domestic minor sex trafficking, all referring to kind of the same issue here. Now, as opposed to what we looked at here, where we got two groups of people, we got the kid, and then we got the adult who's taking advantage of them. When we look at this commercial aspect, we got three groups. So we got the kid, we got the adult taking advantage of them, and we also have the person who's making profit off of it. And so when we think about this, this is where we have somebody who is profiting off of the sexual abuse of this child. Now, back in the day, when folks started to do work around this issue, oftentimes these folks were referred to, or these three categories were referred to as a victim, a pimp, a buyer, or a John. And what I want to encourage us to think about, and this can be hard, especially for our latter two categories, is recognizing all that one has done and all that has been done to someone does not define 100% of who they are. And so this is where we're starting to see some shifts from, instead of referring to somebody as a victim, an individual impacted by trafficking. I know many folks who had been trafficked who did not consider themselves a victim and didn't like when people referred to them in that way, because many times they talked about, it's like they say that and there's this like pity or this sympathy they have for me. It's like, I don't want anybody's pity. I want support, but I don't need pity. Also, when we think about somebody who is exploiting them or purchasing them for sex, and this again becomes, it helps us better understand this larger issue. Because many times when our folks are being trafficked, they don't just see somebody who's raping them. They don't just see somebody who's selling them for sex. And when we only are seeing them in that light, it makes it hard to see all of who these individuals are. All right, so we also see some of our most recent numbers here. Hopefully we'll get some updated ones here in the next year. Another great organization, if you are not familiar with, is called, they're referred to as the National Human Trafficking Hotline. As a side note, they are a great organization if you ever had a kid who was a kid or adult who had been trafficked, where you needed some help with resources. You needed to find out, I got this kid who's trafficked or this adult who's trafficked. Where can I connect them to in the area? They have lists of local resources of organizations who are trained to work with this population. So in 2021, they received, and now with technology, it's not just calling on the phone, but also text and online chats, over 50,000 of those. Now, they've been in existence since 2007. And since 2007, over 24,000 contacts have come from Florida. And, as we look at some of the numbers kind of more currently, and we see just under about 2,000 were received from Florida in the last year. And a good chunk of those were from folks who themselves were being trafficked. So this is, again, a great hotline to be aware of, especially as we recognize many folks being trafficked are reaching out. All right, so when we think about choice, one of the things that makes it a challenge here is with both of our issues that that we look at is when we think about trafficking and when we think about substance use. Again, these things seem like choices. And so when we think about a kid or an adult for that matter being involved in the commercial sex industry, it is ridiculously easy to see it as a choice. When we get defiance or resistance, what's it like when here I come trying to be helpful and supportive, trying to do X, Y, and Z, going out of my way to support them, and all I get is this wall. And that is where, we see it becomes extremely challenging. We also see this glamorization, especially with social media nowadays. What happens when our client is just talking about all the money that they can make? The glitz, the glam, all of that. It makes it really hard to see, hey, there's a lot more going on than the money. When I first started doing work around trafficking, one of the biggest questions I would hear from providers and where they would get stuck is when the kids started to talk about how much money that could be made. And when we broke it down, they realized, one, those kids aren't keeping that money. It's coming through their hands, but it's going just as fast because they don't keep it. But the other thing, we broke down is why was that money so important? And that's many times where we see some of the underlying needs driving this kid into trafficking and remaining in it. It also seems like a choice when that kid runs back. I saw this countless times, especially being connected to residential care. And I would hear provider after provider, in a sense of like, okay, I have the empathy and understanding of trauma when kid initially gets into trafficking. Makes complete sense, got the trauma-informed understanding, check. But when that kid goes back and goes back and goes back and goes back, it makes it really hard to think that's not a choice to go back. And when we think about choice, again, it's hard when we just look at the behavior. And when I'm only seeing this behavior, kid is using substances, kid is running away, kid is fighting, kid is engaged in the commercial sex industry, etc. One of the things that makes it hard to do is hard to see what are some of those things underlying the choice. What are some of those mini choices, so to speak, that have been leading up to this choice right here? Because we can't just look at this choice with right here. Our job is to see what were some of these things going on that led to this kid or adult ending up being trafficked. Absolutely. In the chat we have, similar to somebody who's in domestic violence, there's a big intersection around domestic violence and trafficking. Even on that note, a lot of folks who have been trafficked, when they get out of trafficking, the large majority find themselves in domestic violence relationships. We also can see it can be tempting to focus just on the choice of being trafficked. But we see that there, again, could be other, when we just see that, we don't understand the choice being made. What's that like when, let's say, we have a kid who's experienced all sorts of sexual abuse from early toddler years on up, run away, They meet someone and somebody promises them the world, promises to take care of them. I'm not going to let that happen to them. They end up exploiting them. But in this kid's mind, this is somebody who's protecting them from all that stuff. So their choice is safety, not to be trafficked. What's it like when we have somebody who is so desperate for connection and involved in the commercial sex industry? It feels like they do have a sense of family. They got people who have their back no matter what. And again, this is where it makes it hard if all I'm looking at, kind of with blinders on, are the problematic behaviors they're involved in. It doesn't help me understand why this individual is involved in this. All right, so we are going to think here about just some of the intersection here with trafficking and addiction. And so what we start to see is there's a complex relationship between addiction and trafficking. And successfully prosecuted cases have been proven that the role of substance use disorder in human trafficking is powerful and pervasive. Addiction, we see, can do a few things. It can increase a person's vulnerability to being trafficked. And so if we think about that, what is this like if, let's say, I'm addicted to whatever substances or substance it might be? That in and of itself becomes a pathway of entry, and we'll see that later on. Because what happens is if any addiction, as you all know, that costs a pretty penny. Well, what happens if I'm a kid, if I'm a young adult, and I don't have the money to support my drug habit? Also, if we think about it, and we're going to touch here on familial trafficking here in a moment, when part of my doctorate degree was the last year of the programs is doing a year of full-time internship. And so I did mine at a residential treatment facility in Indiana. And one of my first clients I had there, she was a teenage girl. She was 17. She was wonderful. I loved working with her. And we didn't have the language at the time to say she had been trafficked, but that was her story. Her mom was addicted to multiple substances. And after giving birth, continued to use, and didn't have the money to support her drug habit. And so mom started trading her toddler for sex to support her drug habit. And so, that became such a huge pathway of entry in for that little girl who's now a teenager. Also can be initiated and manipulated by the person trafficking them as a means of coercion and control. So the other thing that can happen is oftentimes we can hear one of two stories. One, somebody has never used a substance before. They enter into the commercial sex industry and are forced to use drugs. I was doing a training the other day with a colleague, yesterday actually, and we shared a story from a teenage girl who had been trafficked. She met somebody online and ended up being trafficked for a couple weeks. And she said, when she met them in person, first thing they did, crush up some pills, and they drugged her. And she was not able to not, ingest those pills. And, and now there's this struggle with substances as a result of that. So sometimes it's literally forced upon you. Other times we could see this choice of give me whatever substance it might be, because that becomes my coping. That becomes my way of numbing out with what is happening. Also, looking here at some previous research on this connection between familial trafficking and substance use. So I just want to pause here for a moment. I believe I mentioned it earlier that when we think about trafficking, one of the pathways of entry that we hear talked about most often is a teenage girl who is lured by a boyfriend who is not really her boyfriend. And for years, that has been the predominant narrative that we've heard. And while that is a common pathway of entry, don't get me wrong, one of the ones we have vastly overlooked is this issue of familial trafficking that we are just now starting to talk about. And so, that would be, if we think about topics to learn more about, I would greatly encourage you to add that topic to your list. And the reason why we've kind of overlooked it is because many folks had assumed familial trafficking, that is something that happens in rural America. It happens out in, the little podunk towns where there's no one. That's not something that happens in the city. Oh, how we have been mistaken. As we are coming to learn more about trafficking in general, we are finding one of the most common pathway of entry into the commercial sex industry is through the family. And to really understand familial trafficking also requires us to tackle an extremely heavy issue of looking at familial sexual abuse. So it makes sense also why we don't want to tackle that, because it is hard to talk about the familial sexual abuse. And what we start to see when we look at those issues is we could see kind of not only grooming in terms of being able to groom the child for the sexual abuse, which sometimes does involve substances. But there's also been this other part of grooming that's been identified, which is referred to as self-grooming. And what is this like when well, let me back up here too before I jump into the slide. One of the other things I'll say about familial sex trafficking and why it becomes such a crucial topic for us to happen with is it really forces us to look at our understanding of trafficking and our understanding of gender. Because again, we have talked about trafficking as if man is kind of the criminal, the bad one. And when we think about who's victimized, we think about a girl. And what we start to see from what we've learned about familial sex trafficking, again, it does not just happen to girls. Actually, a lot of the information that's out there, and I say a lot, there's not really a lot, but the information that's out there looks at this with boys. And we also see it shatters our gendered lens in the sense of it is women who play a big role in this, not just men. All right. And so when we think about this here, this is where we see a few things. So we're going to look at this quote that is kind of broken apart here on the screen. It has to do with the father. And so a father could prepare himself in many ways, kind of that self-grooming. And with that self-grooming, that is where, we see a few things. The substance use or alcohol, starting to view daughter even as the better side of his wife. He can convince himself he's in love with his daughter and having sex with her would not hurt her badly, or that the incest relations are better than cheating. A daughter living in an intrafamilial sexual abuse home can feel she trusts her father, enjoys his affection, and even feels as if she is the one keeping her family strong and united. So again, we could see kind of how twisted this can become. And seeing how kind of substance use plays a role here in trafficking. All right, I'm going to share Elaine's story with you. So give me one moment here while I pull this up on my phone. Elaine loved her father and all the special attention she received. I wanted to show everyone I loved my father for taking me fishing alone, for tucking me in every night, and for restraining my older sissy when she punched me. I was too young to know his love was predicated on his abuse and my obedience. Elaine believes her father's sexual abuse began when she was an infant. And as a side note, unfortunately, that is a statement I've heard many times, and ended only when he left home to live with his girlfriend when she was 12 or 13 years old. Elaine fought the sexual assault from her father and those of the buyers. I was drugged and forced to drink alcohol so I would not fight back. I was forced, completely forced. Plus, any humanity I felt was beaten out of me. I was convinced I deserved the abuse. In order to survive, I needed to be obedient. For Elaine's father, the trafficking venue was the truck stop on a highway running by their house. Elaine was advertised via CB radio using codes and hidden on the steps of the concrete mechanics well in the floor of their garage, concealed by a parked car and oily blankets. The hidden space provided privacy for the men and covered me should any unwanted visitors arrive unannounced. Eventually, the business was expanded to gatherings for pedophiles held in an empty factory, to which she was transported in a van, where the children would be forced to stand in a line and were chosen. When she resisted, alcohol and drugs were used to ensure her cooperation. You know, and one of the things with Elaine's story that we see all too common is we see how when kind of that force, what is it like when you, what is that like when you resist? All right, so we're going to look here at a few examples too. When we look at an example here from Georgia, seeing that a mom and dad in Georgia offered their 14-year-old daughter to the manager of a used car lot so they wouldn't have had to make payments on a minivan that they purchased 2 years prior. The kid who was trafficked to other men, and according to the sheriff's department, there were drugs involved in the family, and the car dealer was a recovering alcoholic with a criminal record. In exchange for drugs, money, and food, and another father was convicted of selling time with his young children. Another example here, in 2016, a mother was out of cash and addicted to heroin. She later pled guilty to handing her 12-year-old daughter, or I'm sorry, her 11-year-old daughter, to a drug dealer for sex in exchange for drugs. Prosecutors said that she took elaborate steps to make her daughter appear even younger than 11, which is hard to believe because when we think about 11, that is a young age, but making it younger, trying to make her look even younger. Prosecutors also said that the children were filmed when they performed sexual acts on him. And one more example here. Teresa Vanover exploited two mentally disabled teen daughters who were 15 and 13. at a neighborhood barbershop, collecting as little as $20 an encounter to support her crack cocaine habit. The owner of the barbershop was also said to be complicit in the scheme. So again, we see a big intersection with trafficking. And when we think about this familial piece, so I mentioned a moment ago that one of the things that's interesting when we think about the familial aspect is just the focus on, or kind of not necessarily the focus, but on the mention of boys. And for those who do work around trafficking, you understand what I mean, because many times we're only talking about this with girls. And we're going to look at some research, a small research study that sent out the trafficking piece, or that looked at the trafficking experience of boys. And we're going to look at a theme. One of them was financial benefit. Why their respective family member, whether that be parent, grandparent, extended family member, sibling, sold them for sex. Sometimes it was to have a medical procedure. And I think we could think about medical procedures in one of two ways. We know medical procedures are crazy expensive. So this can show up with me or someone in the family needing to have a procedure done, and we don't have the money for it. So we need to do this in order to make sure it's getting done. We could also see kind of medical procedure here in the sense of what happens if it's, also not like we don't have the money for this necessary piece. What if it's like a cosmetic piece, and just wanting some enhancement, so to speak, which still costs money. Drugs. We've kind of touched on how drugs are spendy. And when somebody does have an addiction, that is an expensive habit to sustain. It might be simply just for money itself and to be able to go buy things. Another aspect of that financial benefit is an introduction to a network of high net worth individuals. So this is where we start to see there are folks who have a lot of money who are sadly willing to purchase sex from minors. Also, we look at this piece here of a few other things. So it could be that recruitment. And we're going to, look at a few examples of that here, where recruitment can happen when it comes to substance use. The method of controlling, which we touched on, where somebody who's trafficking will encourage them to use those substances, or force them to use those substances. Because guess what? If you are under the influence, you might not resist. And so it becomes kind of prime method of control. And again, the coping. What is it like when you have this option, this coping mechanism, and when you use it, you are not present when all the horrible stuff is happening to you day in and day out. All right, so a few other things we could see. Supporting a drug habit. This becomes big when it comes to, so in this example, we have Ashley. Ashley is addicted to drugs, whatever they might be, and doesn't have money to support that habit. And so as a result of not having that money to support her substance use, Ashley starts to sell herself for sex to support her drug habit. And, and this can be, especially nowadays with things online, it could start maybe with an OnlyFans account. And it just progresses from there. Another example is as we think about recruitment from a detox or recovery facility. And this has been a common one. And this, too becomes problematic because One of the things I hear oftentimes when it comes to substance use providers, and especially when we think about higher levels of care, such as, a residential treatment facility or a recovery facility, is historically we had substance use treatment and we had trauma treatment or mental health treatment. So, if you had anything other than substance use, many times those providers were like, oh, we're not touching that. Or the folks over here, like, you have substance use, go here. And what we see is that's silly because many folks have both. Folks might have substance use issues as well as trauma, as well as other mental health issues. And so this is where it becomes so important that not only do we understand this connection between trafficking and substance use, but it becomes crucial that those providers who are doing work in recovery facilities understand this issue because of the high intersection. All right, so we're going to look at this example here with Bobby. After getting upset at staff, Bobby left the facility. And as Bobby left the facility, someone, kind of approached Bobby. You need a ride? Come get in the car. With no idea of what he would do, he ended up getting in the car. Now, as we think about that, it could be easy and we're going to assume Bobby then ends up being trafficked. And again, it's easy to just look at that behavior down here of being trafficked and not see all of the things that led way, all of those many decisions that led to him leaving the facility, getting in that car. And even as we think about that decision to get in the car, I think this is one of the ways where we could see a sense of disconnection with trauma. So, and I say that because one of those things we see with how trauma can impact someone is it can create a disconnection from self. How am I able to understand what this might not be a great decision? I recognize some of those red flags. Many times we don't recognize those in the moment if we are so disconnected from ourselves. So for me, I'm walking down the street, and if a car with somebody I have no idea who it is pulls up next to me and says, hey, you look like you need a ride, get in. I know that is not a smart decision. I am going through my head all the possible scenarios of what could happen. I might even be starting to walk a little faster, get out my phone, ready to call someone, because I recognize those red flags. But for so many of our folks who've had that history of trauma, there's that sense of disconnection where it's hard to listen to that gut say, this isn't the smartest idea. But what happens when they get in the car and down the line when they start meeting with providers? Again, this is where that shame and judgment comes in. They are looked at and they are judged in a sense for like, what the heck was wrong with you that you got in the car? In the chat wave, I see this a lot. It's scary to see folks leaving without a plan. And not only that, what we see is that sometimes we have folks targeting group homes, recovery facilities, courthouses, shelters, schools, etc., knowing at some point a kid is going to leave, an adult is going to leave, and they're not going to have options. We also have in the chat a great question here about OnlyFans. So yes, so should you be an adult? Yes. In a similar way, should a minor dance in a strip club? No. Do we have minors dancing in strip clubs and on OnlyFans? Absolutely. And so, just because something is not supposed to be, unfortunately, does not mean it always happens. Now, even in what I just mentioned, with sometimes having minors who dance in strip clubs, I mentioned, earlier, a lot of my colleagues around this issue have had lived experience with being trafficked. Many of whom reported when they were minors, they were dancing in strip clubs. And I would hear one of two things. Either they had a fake ID and looked a little older, so they kind of passed as an adult, or strip club owner knew they were a minor and didn't care because they were making money. And so, even we see kind of that piece. We could see that show up, in a few ways. Looking at another example here with recruitment. So let's say for example, kind of I'm at the facility. I have a roommate, and we get into, and not necessarily like we're going at it like physically, but we get into an argument. And I just start feeling like this is worthless. This is not worth it. Like, what am I doing here? Like, I don't want to be here. This is too hard. And many times just that negative spiral is starting to spin. And what is that like when I start talking to my roommate who said we could ditch this party and get, go to this party, friend is having. And we figure out, okay, how do we get a ride? And, friend calls so and so, come give us a ride. We end up at the party not realizing what type of party it was. This reminds me of a couple years ago. I was doing a training. This was actually a few years ago, so it was right before COVID. And I was doing a training in a more kind of rural county in California. And a social worker came up, and you could tell she was like in distress. And she was just like, Nicole, I don't know what to do. And she went on to share how a similar situation happened with one of the girls on her caseload. And she goes, my girl's at placement, and girl had been trafficked, and she was able to talk her friend into going to this party with her. And what ended up happening to the party, friend was drugged, gang raped, and that become kind of pathway of entry into the commercial sex industry for friend. And the girl sat in a chair and watched it all happen. And social worker was just like, and understandably so, like, how do I make sense of this? How do I look at my client in the face, knowing what she allowed to happen to her friend? And as we talked about it and broke down what happened, it made sense. Because it happening to friend meant it wasn't happening to her. Still extremely hard to navigate and to hold and to know what happened. But this is where we start to see how trauma is so messy, for a lack of better wording, where, it becomes this piece where when you are in the midst of it and you have this mind of survival, sometimes you are not even thinking through what you have done to others. And I've heard that from folks who have recruited a friend into the commercial sex industry. And they have carried so much guilt for bringing a friend in, for something extremely horrible happening to friend in the industry. And the other way I've seen that show up with such tremendous amounts of guilt, what happens when you're ready to get out and you brought friend in and friend is so deep in it, they are not ready to leave. It makes it really hard to feel like I deserve help and support because the person I brought in isn't wanting that same help and support. In the chat, we have sometimes, it's a way to save themselves by sacrificing others, and this is where we see just the layers upon layers upon layers of trauma. looking at another pathway of entry. So initiated dependence and a threat of withdrawal. So here we have Mario. He has become addicted to heroin. And this has all occurred while he's being trafficked. Now, granted, him developing this substance use habit could be one of two reasons, one of the two that we looked at earlier. One being Mario chose to use heroin to numb out and to cope. Mario could have been forced to use heroin and developed the addiction. Now we have the situation where he's threatened. If he doesn't go meet his dates or his friends at the hotel, heroin's going to be withheld. So what happens again when there's this physiological dependence on heroin and going through those withdrawals? If anyone, has worked with folks going through withdrawals, or you yourself have experienced it, those withdrawals are unpleasant to say the least. And so what happens when he sees these two options? Go engage in the commercial sex industry or avoid withdrawals. So because of his dependency on heroin and fear of withdrawal, he reluctantly goes to the hotel. In the chat, absolutely, he goes and he meets his dates. In the chat, we also have, I know with my former foster kiddos, they accepted any attention as a form of love and don't realize not all attention from adults is positive. And again, there just speaks to, even in that example there, it speaks to some of the underlying needs of our kids. Because when I see any attention is better than no attention at all, but what happens when I get the attention in the commercial sex industry? And what happens when I don't get it outside of the commercial sex industry? That it really starts to reinforce staying in. So another example we have here is coping. So here we have Jess. And Jess was kicked out of his home. And as Jess, was kicked out of his home, and we're going to also say Jess was part of the LGBTQ community, because we do see a high prevalence across the nation of one of the biggest reasons kids end up homeless is being part of the LGBTQ community. Ends up homeless and ends up, as any kid who's homeless, figuring out, what am I going to do to survive? And figures out, okay, I could sleep at the park. I could sleep under the bridge. I could, in a sense, figure it out. And as a means to cope with feelings of depression, rejection, just anxiety, fear, like overwhelm, what am I going to literally do? Turns to drugs and alcohol to numb. Another reason why we see our kids who are unsheltered turning to substances is sometimes the really dangerous stuff, the bad stuff, it happens in the middle of the night when most of us get a warm bed to sleep in. And so what happens with some of our homeless youth is they turn to drugs to help them stay awake at night, to help protect themselves. And one thing we know is there is such a pathway of entry into trafficking with folks who are unsheltered. And you might hear me say that and think, well, there's homeless shelters. We have these services. But one of the challenges sometimes is for some folks, because of either their experience and or what they have heard, is they would rather take their chances on the street, which is sad to say, because of abuse, rejection, bullying, harassment, and even assault at shelters. Also thinking about coping. So here are another example with coping. We have STAR. And in the chat, we have, I work for the Homeless Coalition in my area, and all of this is so true. We have Star, who is exhausted emotionally, physically, and spiritually from all of the abuse she has continued to experience. And, as she is just overwhelmed by everything, just the weight of it all, she turns to drugs to numb her pain. We also have Sammy here. And Sammy admires her father, looks up to him, has always kind of admired him. And Dad says, hey, I need you to take this package over here. Or I need you to go pick up a package. Don't look in it. Come straight home. And, and what we see is for some of our kids, this becomes a pathway of entry into the labor trafficking market when it comes to substances. And Sammy, especially as Sammy gets a little older, out of fear, may never look in the bag or the backpack, but likely is smart enough to put two and two together and realize what's happening and can feel so conflicted because this is the person she's always admired, always looked up to, and is now, kind of recruited her in to the labor trafficking market. So here we have Liz and Marty, two American youth who were homeless after families kicked them out. And they answered a website. So again, as we start to think about, kind of recruitment, even things through like websites and job ads. Once they were flown to their host family's home, they were forced to work every day and sexually assaulted by the father of the household who used drugs to sedate them. And not only do we see again this example of using drugs to control, but we also see how we have some groups, such as our homeless population, that are at significantly higher risk of being exploited than some of our other populations. Also, similar to traumatic stress effects on the brain, substance use disorder involves biochemical changes to the brain and adds an additional layer of risk, especially for survivors with post-traumatic stress disorder. So although addiction is scientifically understood as a medical condition and not as a moral weakness, the societal stigma surrounding both the condition and the sufferer is perhaps pervasive. And the negative stereotype persists of the chemically dependent person as morally deficient and lacking in willpower. So again, this is where we start to see how problematic this becomes when we are seeing somebody as they're just weak. They aren't strong. That is not what's happening at all. And what we see going back to the very beginning, as we talked about some of the stigma around trafficking and some of the stigma around substance use. And we start to see how that stigma surrounding both of these conditions makes it extremely difficult to get help. It also makes it really difficult for social workers, probation officers, clinicians, group home staff, law enforcement, prosecutors, teachers, healthcare providers, and the list could go on and on and on. Makes it hard for us to then identify folks who are being trafficked when all we see is somebody who's addicted to whatever it might be. And if all I see is the substance use, I might overlook some of these telltale signs that this kid or this adult might be trafficked. All right, so thinking here about impact. And, I want to think about some of the ways that both trafficking as well as substance use and that combination thereof, how it can impact someone. And as we think about this, this probably is not a surprise to anyone, but it's a reminder for us of how long of a healing journey it is. It is also a reminder for us of how important it is to get our kid connected to service providers who understand trauma, who understand trafficking. And that is huge. It's also something that when we think about kind of just ethics, in the sense of why would we send our kid to someone when they have an issue and the provider doesn't know how to treat that issue? If we think about it in a related way, going to a medical provider. If I injured myself and I go to my medical doctor and my medical doctor doesn't have specialty training, doesn't have specialized training in whatever way, injury I have, that's not who I want to see. But many times we find ourselves referring our kids to providers who don't have the specialized training in this topic to work with them. And sometimes then we get frustrated about not seeing the outcomes. So this is where it's important that we continue to learn more. So again, we could see some of the mental health impacts. We could see high rates of depression. Makes sense in everything we're talking about because it's super depressing being stigmatized. It's super depressing being traumatized, etc. We could see those PTSD symptoms. And one of the challenges is even in the name of post, because for many folks, this is happening in real time. So it's not just, what happened way back when, but it's stuff that's continuing to happen. We could see aggression, and two, it makes sense. There are so many big emotions one might experience. And this also speaks to our need as service providers to better understand trauma, to better understand our trauma stress response. And when we think about understanding a trauma stress response, this is where we're reminded our trauma stress response kicks in not only in moments where I perceive danger, let me back up. Not only in moments where I'm actually in danger, my life is actually on the line, but it also shows up in moments I perceive danger. Meaning, I could be in the classroom, I could be at work, something happens, no one else is responding in this way, but I do. And it's because I am perceiving a threat even though no one else is. And that's where that trauma stress response gets annoying, to say the least, is when long after the trauma is gone, when folks don't get help and support, that trauma stress response shows up again. We could also see emotionally avoidant behaviors, so as we start to think about trafficking through our lens of trauma, and as we think about trafficking through our lens of trauma, and we think about how we are seeing it as relational trauma. And so we want to think about a few things. How much harm, how much betrayal, how much not being able to turn to people who should support you and care for you and love you comes into play. And when we think about this relationally, for so many of our clients, we want to not only think about the trauma of while they are being trafficked, but we want to back up. And I say we want to back up because sadly, for the large majority of folks, and I would say nearly every person I have worked with and or encountered who had been trafficked had an early childhood sexual abuse history, some of whom started during infancy. And so think about just that. Think about some of those clients as well coming from generational trauma, meaning they are coming from generations who haven't had opportunities to heal and address those wounds. So how does that impact that parent's ability to parent kid and then kids experiencing all this abuse? And this is where we start to see the relational impact when we think about how does that trauma impact boundaries and one's understanding of boundaries? How does it impact betrayal? One young woman who was trafficked, also who had abused substances, she said it so well. And she said, let me back up. So she was doing some curriculum review, and she was asked, we asked her, what do you think is important for providers to know to better work with minors or young adults who'd been trafficked? And she said, it is so important to understand our perspectives are so different. And she went on to say how for her and people she was in community with, she goes, it is not a matter of if other people will hurt me or betray me, for me and for us, it's a matter of when. For you, she goes, it's a matter of if. And with that, she goes, there are people out there who will do bad things. But she goes, the difference is, there are people out there who are trustworthy. And she goes, for us, for me, our experience has been so horrible that time and time again, when somebody has been in a position to care for us, to love us, to protect us, they have betrayed us and hurt us and exploited us. So I anticipate when I meet someone, that is what they're going to do to me. So if I'm someone like that, walking into a situation, anticipating you are going to exploit me, you're going to abuse me, you're going to betray me, you aren't going to follow through on what you said, how is that impacting every aspect of relationship? And don't be mistaken here thinking, well, I would never do something like that. And hopefully every person on here would say that. But we also want to think about who we represent and the titles we hold and the positions we are in. A few years ago, with one of my friends and colleagues, we used to do more trainings together. And she is somebody who has lived experience of being trafficked. And when we would do kind of more of just like an overview training, she did this exercise probably for about a span of a year. And it went the same way every time she did it. And what she would do is she would ask, for folks in the audience to raise their hand and share what their respective title or position was. And so, we got the range of, I'm an attorney, I'm a social worker, I'm a therapist, I'm a teacher, I'm a case manager, etc. Every time somebody shared their title, her response to them was, somebody who had your title purchased me for sex when I was a minor. Not once, and she did this exercise probably 20 some times that I saw her do it. Not once was her response different. So when we think about, again, it speaks to our understanding of trauma. The relational harm shows up. Do I see it? Isolation. For many, because of the shame and because of the stigma, folks feel like they aren't accepted. I've heard many folks who have been trafficked, also who have struggled with substances and the intersection there, have said, I feel like I'm walking down the hallway or I'm walking down the street with a scarlet letter on where people know what I've done and what has happened to me just by looking at me. And if that's the way you feel, like automatically you're rejected, how does that impact your interactions with other people? You know, when you feel like I won't be accepted, I will never be accepted, or it starts to feel like I will be, but I just can't tell anyone about my past. We also see a big intersection here with eating disorders, substance use, you know, so again, we start to see just some of the manifestations of trauma, engaging in high risk sexual activities. You know, and the other thing I want to say about this with some of the long-term impact is we could so easily make the assumption this individual, whether it is an adult or whether it's a child, they don't need sex education because they're involved in the commercial sex industry. And that is a silly misunderstanding because for so many of these folks, their introduction to sex was rape. Rape is not sex education. Rape does not teach you what healthy sex looks like, what it feels like. It doesn't teach you about family planning, any of that. So it's also crucial that we think about how are we getting our folks connected to folks who could help them understand and work through what intimacy looks like, what healthy sex looks like. All right, so as we think about, and we're going to kind of spend the rest of our time here really thinking about what are some of the things we could do to support folks who are impacted by trafficking and substance use. And we're kind of just touching on these, and we're going to break these down here a little bit more when it comes to kind of attachment focus. So again, we want to focus on the relationship. We want to think about trauma-informed care and really thinking about how am I understanding these behaviors? How am I understanding choice through that lens of trauma? How am I understanding that choice to use substances as through that understanding of trauma? Strengths-based approach. This becomes huge. Somebody mentioned earlier in the chat about attention. I've heard this from our kids. What happens when in the commercial sex industry, I am put up on a pedestal? I'm adored. People are telling me, granted, most of the comments might be about my body, but I am still put up on the pedestal. And outside of the commercial sex industry, all I hear is nag, 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 nag. You aren't doing this right. You shouldn't be doing that, X, Y, and Z, and it's all negative. So to get any sort of kind of uplift, it's over there. We also want to make sure our services are informed by folks who've been trafficked. You know, this is where we want to think about how can we involve folks who've been trafficked. And that this could be, you know, a whole other discussion about how do we partner with folks who've been trafficked in ways that don't do harm to them and that really capitalize on their experiences and their knowledge, where they aren't tokenized and we aren't further traumatizing them by their involvement. But we see there is such value with folks who have lived experience. In a similar way, we see this within the substance use and recovery field. We see the value in working with folks who've had that lived experience of going through a recovery. There's something a little bit more intimate those folks understand about the journey than those of us who haven't walked that line. Harm reduction. As we think about how this is hard work because despite the numerous harms, some of which we didn't even dive into today, that are associated with involvement in the commercial sex industry and or labor trafficking even, it would be wonderful if anytime we would work with someone who was engaged in a dangerous, exploitive, harmful behavior or relationship, and they talk to us, they would just stop it. Domestic violence relationship, they'd leave. Substance use, they'd stop. Self-harm, it would stop automatically, etc. But unfortunately, we know that is not reality. And we know just because we think life would be better for them if they stopped doing it doesn't mean they stop doing it like that. Even when we commit to doing something, for many of us, because we're human, it takes us multiple attempts to do it before we do it and we maintain that. And so in that process, that is where harm reduction principles become really helpful. Also, this is where the stages of change come in. You know, as we think about how do we understand where somebody is at in their change process, and that becomes crucial to make sure that how I'm interacting with them matches where they are. So we're going to kind of dive into these a little bit more here for a moment. So a few things. One, as we think about, you know, again, this focus on attachment. And this is that relational focus, because when we think about the harm, the betrayal, the hurt, it occurs relationally. It is done by another human being or other human beings. And again, many times it started in the home, and it starts with that early childhood sexual abuse. So we see kind of just this pattern of hurt and betrayal. What we see is that when hurt and betrayal occur in a relationship, it will that healing is naturally going to come relationally, and that does not happen overnight. And there is so much more we could say and talk about, and we could dive into a whole other, you know, webinar here, just talking about that relational component and what that looks like to help foster healing relationally. But for our sake of time, you know, that is all we are going to say, is that we want to think intentionally about how am I using my relationship with them, whether I am somebody who is a first responder or I'm a child abuse investigator determining whether or not this kid stays in the home or not, or I am fortunate to be someone working with them over time. However many minutes or months I have with them, how am I intentionally showing them a different experience of a human being who is in a position of authority? Because again, for so many, they have been so hurt and betrayed. Also, as we think about many of the labels our kids have, our young adults have, from being a sex traffic victim, to being a prostitute, to being an addict, to being somebody who self-harms, to, you know, whatever other behavior is problematic that they're engaging in. And if I'm only seeing those behaviors, this is where it is so tempting just to focus on those behaviors. And one of the big questions I would get constantly when I started doing work around trafficking from providers is, what do we talk about when they don't want to talk about their trafficking? And one of the biggest things, pieces of advice I would say, is talk to them about anything else. How, you know, if this kid is 17, how else would you talk to a 17-year-old? How else would you talk to a 12-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 22-year-old? Because what happens is if I only want to talk about the trauma and drama, how am I not reinforcing that it's kind of all that you are? If I want them to see themselves as more than the trauma and drama, I need to reinforce that there's more to their life than that, which means I need to get to know them as a human being. In the chat, we have my mentee I've known since she was 10, was trafficked at 12. She's now 17 and just beginning to open and speak with me about her experiences. It's so important to be consistent and let them speak when they're comfortable about it. Absolutely. You know, and again, that's where we start to see some of the relational harm. When we start to see how, you know, I might know from day one I'm trustworthy, but in this example, it took this kid 17 years to see you're trustworthy. It takes time. And the time, again, comes from our understanding of how much trauma is there. And this too is when we think about our understanding of trauma, this is also where we recognize there is so much trauma our kids experience. There's so much grief and loss. This is a population that has had so many people killed. It has been remarkable hearing them talk about the laundry list of people they've known who have died. And this is like a teenager. You know, there's so much from adversity to many aspects of trauma. You know, it really speaks to how are we understanding what it is, what the trauma is, how it manifests, how it shows up in problematic behaviors, how it impacts their brain development, how it impacts development, how it shows up relationally. Also, when it comes to kind of that strength-based approach, it is tempting with some of our clients who have lots of behaviors going on. They're running away, they're using substances, they're cutting, they have a few choice words for so-and-so and everything else. It is really tempting to get lost in the moment in all of those problematic behaviors. But again, we want to see the strength and the resiliency that's there. Even going back to just thinking about that trauma-informed piece. Being trauma-informed is more than just seeing the trauma. It is seeing the strength and that resiliency that is there. And so this requires me not just to see the problematic behaviors, but what are the things, what are some of those strengths, some of which might be hidden in there and I can need to bust out my detective glass to see it. But we have to think about, if I don't see their strengths, how do I expect them to? If I don't see their worth, how do I expect them to? And also, if I'm not pointing out their strengths and helping them figure out ways to tap into those, what am I pointing out to them? And if I'm not pointing out those strengths, I'm just pointing out more than likely all the things, the shoulda, woulda, couldas, the things they aren't doing well. So when we think about harm reduction, this is where, you know, with harm reduction, we could see really this shift from eliminating harm, which is the ideal, to reducing harm. And harm reduction has been oftentimes, let me back up. So harm reduction oftentimes is used with substance use. Folks who are on, who do work specifically around substance use are likely familiar with harm reduction. Now, when it comes to our folks who have been trafficked, this is something that is in the past, you know, maybe 4 or 5 years is starting to be recognized as, hey, we really need to start incorporating some of this. When I was doing work in California and we started to do a lot of training and work around this issue, one of the things we ran into is folks were a little hesitant with harm reduction. It was like, this sounds wonderful, but I think I'm going to get in trouble by my supervisor if I don't tell them just to stop. And the California Department of Social Services was hearing that feedback so much, they came out with a brief, kind of putting their stamp of approval on using harm reduction with this population. So when there was that fear of like, I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for this, folks could be able to go back to the state as, you know, with a reference and say, hey, child welfare has given us a stamp of approval here. And so, you know, we have this shift from eliminating to reducing, from safest to safer. And one of the things at the core of harm reduction is communicating you are a worthy human being. You are communicating compassion, because by being able to embrace someone wherever they may be in their journey, there is something so comforting in recognizing you see me, you embrace me where I'm at. Not when I stop using, not when I get out of the industry, when I stop running away, etc. You see me and embrace me now. And so when we think about harm reduction, we want to think about how can you increase safety? And when you get there, how can you increase it a little bit more and a little bit more? And we recognize you're already doing some things to keep yourself safe right now. How can we build off of that? And this becomes so crucial, whether we're talking about this in regards to running away, because this kid has run away for years, and as wonderful as I might be, they're probably not going to stop simply because they met me, because it's been their main coping for the past couple of years, to substance use, to somebody engaged in the commercial sex industry. Again, we want to help them think about how can they be safer, and how could they be safer, and how can they be safer. Last thing we're going to touch here on is the stages of change model. And each of these we're touching on, we could spend a whole day talking about each and every one of these. And so these become, as we think about wanting to learn more, these become some of those areas for us to learn more in. So the stages of change becomes a great model when it comes to better understanding this population and where are they at. And so kind of in a nutshell here, we're really looking at, is this somebody who is not yet ready to even make a commitment to change? And if so, our focus becomes on, let me help get them to the place of making a commitment to change. Once somebody makes that commitment to change, then we work with them on putting it into play. And we also recognize change in life is so much harder than anyone intends it to be. So there might be those times of going back to a previous stage, that recycling, where somebody might have a lapse or a relapse. And you'll also see kind of re-victimization on there, because that's also when we're thinking about minors, that reminder that by state and federal legislation, when our minors are involved in the commercial sex industry, by law, they are considered a victim. And the stages of change is important for us to understand for a few reasons. One, it helps us better understand where our kid is, our adult is, and it helps us focus on getting them to the next stage rather than help getting them to abstinence, which is our long-term goal. It helps us break down our goals. The other thing organizationally it does, it helps us look at who the population is we serve, and helps us think about, is how our program is designed, does it match the population we're serving? And what we see across the nation is the large majority of programs, the answer to that question is no. And so we see from an organizational standpoint a mismatch between who we serve and how our program is designed. And the last thing, is really thinking about seeing that one is more than what happened to them. And we want to be intentional with helping folks think about and see themselves as more than what has happened to them. With that, again, this is a heavy topic. And so really want to encourage folks to take care of you. I'm going to hand it over to Robert here in a moment. If there are any other thoughts or questions, now is your time to chime on in. I'll include some of my information in the chat in case anyone has any follow-up or wants to learn more about kind of our organization and some of what we do. But again, this is a heavy one. And this is a reminder for us to take care of us. So want to thank you all for joining today. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Robert.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly, for that wonderful information and presentation. I know that this has been a highly requested topic from our participants, and I know that this training has been appreciated. Everyone, I've included Dr. Kelly's contact information so that you can contact her with any further questions. Please note a couple of business items before we conclude today's webinar. First, see the chat panel for a link to today's survey. I will repost it here in just a moment. Additionally, when I end the webinar, your web browser will populate a message that looks like the image on the screen. It will say the host or presenter would like WebEx meetings to open a website on your computer. Please click continue to be automatically redirected to the evaluation. To complete the evaluation, you must sign into your account. If you do not have an account with VADA, you can register for one at no cost. You may do so by clicking Haven't Registered Yet underneath the login menu. Please use the same email address you used when you registered for today's webinar when you set up your profile in FATA system. This is the only way for us to connect your attendance and your profile. For CEs to be reported to CE Broker for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, you must provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license prefix and number the first time you register. If you need to add or update your license number, you may do so by logging in and clicking Edit on the Professional Information section of your profile. You will get another opportunity to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email later today. Please remember that the evaluation will close at the end of the day on Tuesday, October 29th, 2024. For assistance with account login, account registration, or evaluation completion, please fill out a Contact Us form on our website or email training@floridabaj.org. We do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be posted to the professional development section of your profile in your FATA account within 30 business days. You must have attended the entire webinar and completed the evaluation for a statement of completion. We are not permitted to provide partial credit. As a reminder, the recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FATA website within 30 business days. To access the recording and PowerPoint, visit www.fata.org, navigate to the Resource Center, and click on the Training Library as shown on the screen. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Kelly, for the presentation. We'd also like to recognize and thank the Florida Department of Children and Families for funding today's education. Have a great day, everyone, and please hold for the evaluation.